Hey, I'm sitting here in my office and middle of summer, all alone, nobody else in here. How does that affect how I'm going to behave? Would I act differently if I was not being filmed? Would I act differently if there was a student in here? I may say, hey, come on, come in. Those kind of things and be nice. I might sit here and be wolfing down a sandwich, which I may not do if there's a student around. There are different things. I may be crunching. I have some mints here. I may not take a mint if there was somebody here, but I may be wolfing them down if I'm alone. Social aspects of behavior. How do we how does how do the people around us determine how we're going to behave? How do the people around us affect our behavior? Again, psychology is all about human behavior. Well, what does the fact that I'm sitting in my office by myself in the middle of the summer, how does that affect my behavior? One, you can see what I'm wearing. I'm not because it's the middle of summer and I'm alone. I'm not in front of a class, so I'm dressed more casually than I probably would if I was teaching a class. Okay? So again, that's part of social psych. So what is this social psychology? How does being around people affect behavior? The first thing is what we want to talk about is attributions. Attributions are your reasoning why something happened. How do you attribute a result? For instance, let's say you get a test grade back and you got an A on the test. Why? How do you explain that result? Attributions are how do people explain behavior, and it can be explaining their own behavior or explaining the behavior of others. We're moving into the social psych realm here. Their dimensions to attributions are locus of control, stability, and controllability. Locus of control is basically, am I in control of that outcome or action or not? Say I got an A on the test. Did I say that I got the A because I studied really hard? I was in control. I did it. Okay? Or did I get that A because I was lucky? That would be not my control. That's the locus of control. Stability is it something that is likely to change? I studied really hard as a reason for getting an A on a test. That could be something that's changeable or not. That's kind of in the middle. It's changeable, but it could stay the same. If you're talking about an internal, I got an A on the test because I'm really smart. That's something that people can think of as stable, or they can think of, that's the stability aspect. Do you think of that as stable or not? Is that something that is likely to lead to you getting more A's on a test, or is it very changeable? The last one is controllability. Similarly to locus of control, is it something within you or without you? But it's more literally, is it controllable? Something may be not from you, but it could also be controllable. Okay? The amount of classes you're taking can be controllable. Okay? The amount of effort you put in can be controllable. So, talking to the instructor, it's locus of control is who has control. And controllable means, is it something that you have a handle on? Is basically, those are the dimensions of attributions. Now, we also have what's called situational or dispositional attributions. Situational is something happened because of something in the environment, because of the situation. You have a person that cuts you off in traffic. Okay? They cut you off in traffic, and the question is why. A situational attribution might be, hey, they were having a really bad day. They were just given some bad news. They're grumpy. That's why they did it. Okay, that would be situational. It was something that was just because of the moment, because of what was going on. That would be situational. Dispositional would be more stable. It's within them. They cut me off because they're just a grouchy person. That's situational versus dispositional. Dispositional is more having to do with a person's personality. And situational is what's going on. So this is, you're describing why things happen. We also have what's called the fundamental attribution error. And that is when we judge behavior, we're more likely to judge our own behavior as situational. Oh, I only cut the person off in traffic because I was frustrated because I needed to be at a certain place at a certain time. We tend to judge our own behavior as more situational, more variable. We judge the behavior of others as more dispositional. We're more likely to judge others' behavior as more dispositional. That's the fundamental attribution error, finding dispositional reasons for other people's behavior and fundamental and situational reasons for our own behavior. Now, those that are close to us can fall somewhere in between. In other words, maybe you're judging somebody's behavior, but it's not a total stranger. You may know the situation around that behavior more and be more likely to judge it as situational. So that fundamental attribution error really talks about ourselves. It's that ourselves versus people we don't know. Now, we also have biases when we talk about attributions. We have the actor-observer bias, which is similar to the fundamental attribution error. It's the fact that if we're the person doing it, we're more likely to see situational factors. If we're observing it, we're more going to look at dispositional. We have a self-serving bias. We want to make ourselves look good. If you fail a test, it makes you look good to say, I just didn't study. It's a more self-serving reason than saying, oh, I failed the test because I'm terrible at that subject. Okay? If we do well on a test, it's self-serving to say, I did well because I'm so smart, as opposed to, I did well because I got lucky. Right? Self-serving bias in terms of attributions. We tend to look at the stuff that will make ourselves look good. We also have this thing called the just world hypothesis. As human beings, we want to believe that the world is fair. We have this desire to believe that the world is fair. And sometimes that leads to what they call blaming the victim. Sometimes that leads to us assuming reasons for something that are not necessarily true. Somebody is in poverty, and we want to believe that the world is fair. We don't want to believe that people could be in poverty because of something out of their control, which is the truth. They could be. In the end, we see somebody who's in poverty, and we don't, unless we know that person, we don't know why. We have no idea whether it was something out of their control or something within their control. But the just world hypothesis talks about how it's human nature when we're looking at somebody and we're looking at something that's happening to believe that people deserve what they get, because we want to believe that the world is fair. So we are more likely to have that. That's where some of that attitude of blaming the victim comes from. If somebody is in poverty, then they've done something to deserve it. If somebody gets attacked, they must have done something to deserve it. That's where you get that's where you get this idea of blaming the victim. It's related to that. No, it's not fair. It's one of those things that as human beings, that sometimes we make wrong assumptions because we want to believe, again, that the world is fair, and the world is not always fair. So that's attributions. We also have this idea of self-presentation in terms of when we're around others, how do we present ourselves? First, we have social rules and norms. Social rules are basically, are there certain rules about thou shalt do this? They may not be written, but they're there. In other words, a social rule, there may be a social rule that you tend to sit in the same seat when you're in a class, when you're in a classroom. I found that out. And I'm sure you all have too, that when you go into a college classroom, the first week or so of class is this kind of, you figure out where you want to sit. And then from then on, people generally sit in the same place. It's that kind of social rule, okay? There's also social norms, norms of behavior. Things like you shouldn't come to class in a bathing suit. You don't start screaming obscenities when you're in a library. The norms of behavior. In terms of things you do, you come to class. You say please and thank you. You open the door for somebody when you can. Just little things, normal things of behavior. Social norms. When you go to a restaurant, when you go to a fast food place, you walk up to the counter and you figure out what you want, and you politely tell the cashier what you want. That's what the typical way of behaving is. Those are norms. Now, roles also, social roles are parts we play in life. I have many social roles. I'm a professor. I'm a mom. I'm a wife. Okay. I am a mentor. I'm a tutor. I am a learner of Spanish. One of my goals is to finally be fluent. But so I have a lot of roles. So when I'm in school, I'm a professor. That's my role. My role is to teach and to explain things to help people understand different concepts. When I'm at home, I have the role of a wife and a mother. I have the role of being a partner with my husband and working things out and figuring out what are we going to do and when are we going to do it and all that kind of stuff. I have a role of a mom. I have the role of making sure that my 15-year-old gets to soccer practice. My role as a mom is also making sure my oldest son is going off to college this fall. I have the role of making sure that he gets all his T's crossed and I's dotted and everything done for going to college. So that's social roles are kind of the role that you play. I act differently at home than I do at work. And you all act differently with your friends than you do when you're in class. So that's kind of what social roles are. Along with that, there was a guy who did an experiment that really delved into social roles. Zimbardo's prison experiment. He did this experiment at Stanford where he had people sign up for a study, and it was a study on basically, can you make nice people do bad things? And what he did was he made a makeshift prison to make it look like totally real. And he had some people sign up, and he gave some people the role of guards and some people the role of prisoners. He wanted to find out what would happen, how far they would take it, and how much they would get into the role. Turned out they got into it too much. The prisoners were very much abused. The guards had a power trip, essentially. And the power went to their heads, and they started acting mean. They started making the prisoners do stuff that they shouldn't have been doing. They had to stop the experiment early because of what was going on. They took it to too far of an extreme. So the people were taking those roles to an extreme. And it's this, he called it the Lucifer effect. You can make good people, put in a situation, and again, this is social psych. You can make good people do bad things. You go back to part of this, people would explain Nazi Germany, where you're putting on roles and seeing people doing horrific things. And you're kind of copying that behavior. So there's a lot of things with that, with social roles. So we have attributions, self-presentation, okay? Then we have attitudes and persuasions. What is an attitude? I mean, you sometimes tell kids, hey, don't give me that attitude, right? Stop giving me that attitude or you're going to get in trouble. So I don't know how many people have heard that. So what is an attitude? Now, an attitude is not necessarily, I mean, you can say that, stop giving me that attitude. That would be a bad attitude. But attitude can be basically your feeling about something. And it can be bad or good. I have a really bad attitude about hard-boiled eggs. I don't like them. Okay? I have a dislike of hard-boiled eggs. That's an attitude. I don't like hard-boiled eggs. I have a good attitude of dark chocolate. I love it. I have a good attitude, my husband and my kids. I love my husband and my kids. So thinking about them makes me feel good. So a good attitude, okay? I have a good attitude when it comes to psychology. I like the concept. I like figuring out what makes people tick. So it's this positive, I like it. That's generally what attitudes are. You like it, you don't like it, okay? It's the feelings that you have towards something, feelings and perceptions. How do we form attitudes? There are a lot of different ways we form attitudes. We form attitudes through experiences. I've had experiences with my husband and my kids, positive experiences, experiences that we shared together, okay? And those experiences have shaped my attitudes. Hard-boiled eggs, I've eaten hard-boiled eggs and I didn't like them. So that's primarily through experience. So experiences for one. We can also shape attitudes by vicarious experience, like listening to other people and hearing about other people's experiences can shape our attitudes. Mass media. Media can shape our attitudes. Where we get information. It can shape our attitudes, getting information, good, bad, or indifferent, and where we get our information can shape our attitudes. So we can have our personal experiences, we can have information that we gather, okay? There's a lot of different, we can have information that we personally gather, we can have information that's told to us, we can have, again, our own experiences. There's a lot of different things that can affect our attitudes. The emotion that comes forth from others can affect our attitudes. Okay? So, that's how we form them. There's also this idea, when you're talking about attitudes, there's also this idea of what's called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a mismatch. It's a mismatch between attitudes or a mismatch between attitudes and actions. So, let me carry this through. Let's say I told you that I love dark chocolate, okay? Somebody were to walk in here and offer me a piece of dark chocolate. You would think I would be like, oh yeah, give it to me. I really do. Or maybe I wouldn't act like that. I would be, yeah, sure, I'd love a piece of dark chocolate. That's not true. Because I would be experiencing cognitive dissonance. Let me explain. Cognitive dissonance is two opposing beliefs or attitudes. I love dark chocolate. I also don't want to gain weight. Okay? So I love dark chocolate, but I think maintaining my weight is important. So those two things are conflicting because eating dark chocolate does not go with maintaining weight. Okay? So I hopefully would say no if somebody came in and offered me a piece of dark chocolate. I honestly don't know if I would have the willpower, but that's cognitive dissonance. I love it, but I'm not eating it because. Okay? Another example. My youngest son likes horror movies and horror stuff. He likes to read Stephen King. I don't particularly like horror movies. But guess who's seen horror movies? Because my son likes it, my husband likes them, so I will go along for them. Cognitive dissonance. It's a disconnect between my actions and my beliefs. I don't like horror movies, yet what am I doing sitting in here watching them? People who smoke sometimes have cognitive dissonance. They believe smoking is bad, but yet they do it anyway. So, what does this do? If you have cognitive dissonance, if you have two opposing beliefs, or an opposing belief and an action, in other words, you're smoking, you believe smoking is bad, but you're doing it anyway, there's different ways to handle it. One is to change either the belief or the action. In other words, stop smoking, or change your belief and say, smoking isn't really bad for you. Okay, so that's one option, is to change your belief or change your action. The other option is to rationalize it. To, for instance, say, like I said, I'm going to a horror movie for my husband and my son. I know I really don't like it, but I'm doing it because. They've done experiments looking at paying people money to do stuff. And if they only paid them $1, or if they weren't getting paid, if it was something they didn't want to do, but they ended up doing it anyway, then their rating of it actually increased. They're like, oh, that wasn't so bad. But if they paid them money, and more money made it more this way, then they said, oh, I didn't like it. Because they knew, I didn't like it, but I did it for the money. They were able to rationalize it. Okay? So changing your belief, changing your attitudes, putting something else in there to rationalize it. That's a lot of the ways we deal with cognitive dissonance. So if you're smoking, but if you really think smoking is bad, but you're smoking anyway, you can decide smoking isn't that bad. You can quit smoking, or you can say, I know it's bad and I know I'm doing it, but I am addicted to nicotine and I've tried everything and there's no way I can quit. So you can use the whole rationalization thing. That's cognitive dissonance. Again, a disconnect between attitudes and beliefs, or disconnect between two attitudes. So then you have this idea when you talk about attitudes. How do you change someone's attitude? How do you persuade somebody? You have somebody who believes that juuling is totally wonderful, and you want to persuade them that there are health risks and it's not something they should do. How do you do that? Or you're wanting to get a donation from somebody. You're trying to raise money for a charity and you want to get a donation. And you want to change somebody's attitude to get them to give a donation. How do you do that? Well, we have the Yale Attitude Change Approach, which looks at the source, the message, and the audience. Basically, you're trying to change an opinion. And you're looking at this, in order to do that, you're looking at the source, the message, and the audience. So let's say I wanted to get people to donate. Well, the source would be who's providing the information. Where's the information coming from? Okay. The message is, what's the message? Well, why should you donate? It's the actual thing of telling me why I should. You're trying to convince me. to donate money. Then the source would be you or whatever actor you got to give a commercial. The message would be why I should donate. And the audience would be me, the person receiving the message. So if I'm trying to, for instance, persuade a class of students, then I would be the source as a person who knows a lot about psychology. The message would be whatever I'm trying to convey to them, and the audience would be the students. Then we have the elaboration likelihood method, which looks at central and peripheral routes of persuasion. How do you change somebody's mind? Central route, provide them information. Somebody doesn't think juuling is bad, show them why it's bad. Give them the possible health outcomes. That is the central route. The peripheral route is dealing with people's emotions. That's why, for instance, on commercials, you see very attractive people. Because they don't tell you, oh, use our product and you're going to look like this. But they want you to, in the back of your mind, think that. And that is the peripheral route of change, is looking at people's emotions and kind of sidestepping and going that way. So we have attitudes and persuasion. The last thing is you have this foot in the door technique, and with that is the door in the face. The foot in the door technique is often talked about when you're talking about things like getting donations, getting people to do stuff. And what you do is you ask for something little. So you go to somebody and you say, can you just give $1? And they'll be like, sure. So you ask for something you know is easy to get. And then once they acquiesce, well, you gave $1 anyway, I can convince you to give $5. Can you volunteer one day a week to do something? Or one day a month to do something? Sure, no problem. Oh, can you do 2? That's the foot in the door. You get them to do a little bit, and then once they have acquiesced and said they would do it, then it's easier to get them to do more. The door in the face is the opposite. You might ask somebody, we want you to give a $100 donation. And the person will say, no way. And you're like, okay, what about 10? Or we want you to volunteer once a week. And you're like, no, I can't do that. Well, what about just once a month? That's the door in the face. The foot in the door is starting small and getting bigger. The door in the face is slamming them with something big and then getting what you really want. Okay, another piece of social psych is how can the social group influence the individual? And one of these things is when you're looking at conformity. Conformity is basically following the crowd. There was a Candid Camera episode where people turned around backwards in an elevator. And when people got in, they would turn around backwards, just kind of doing what they said. There's this thing, if you watch the movie A Few Good Men, then one of the things was they did the code red because they were following orders. They were told to. A lot of, back when you're looking at Nazi Germany, people's excuse for the atrocities were, I was just following orders. So these are looking at both obedience to authority, following orders, and then the idea of conformity, which is following the crowd. There was a guy named Ash who did a study on conformity where he made people think it was a study on perception, and he had these cards, these things up that had 3 different lines and then another line, and you were basically to say which the one single line, which one did it fit. And the person that was the subject was either the last or one of the last people in line to give their responses. What he wanted to know is, you go through a couple times where people are giving the right answer. He wanted to know if everybody before you gave an obviously wrong answer, what would happen? Would the person follow the crowd, or would the person give the correct answer, do the right thing? And he found that it was a mix. Sometimes they followed the crowd, sometimes they did the right thing. Why do we follow the crowd? Well, we follow the crowd because of normative and informational social influence. Informational social influence would be we follow the crowd because we think the crowd knows more than we do. I'll be honest, if I was in Ash's study and everybody else was saying, well, that line looks the same, I don't know what I would do, because I might think it was some kind of illusion. I might just be, I talk enough, I might be blunt enough to say, well, to my eyes, it looks like this one, but I'm assuming you all are right because my eyes aren't that good. So I'm assuming there's some trick to this. And maybe that's the professor in me. I probably would literally say that. Like, to my eyes, it looks like this, but you can put me down for the same because I'm kind of assuming that there's something going on here. That's informational social influence. That's when you're following the crowd because you literally think the crowd knows what they're doing. You literally think the crowd knows more than you do. Normative social influence is that you're following the crowd because you want to belong. You're following the crowd. You're saying that B is the right line, even though you know it's A, because you don't want people to look at you funny. You want to be accepted. That's normative social influence. You want the group to think good of you. So you're going to toe the line. So that's conformity. The other big thing in this section is obedience. And obedience is, what we were talking about is, I was just following orders. Do people follow orders? To what extent? One of the most famous experiments that looked at obedience to authority was Milgram. Milgram did this experiment where he brought people in and he told them it was an experiment on teaching and learning. And there was one subject, and the subject would come in, be told that it was an experiment on teaching and learning, and then go through a process where they would draw a paper and learn, oh, I'm the teacher. And it was rigged. The subject would always get teacher. And they said, oh, what you're going to do is you're going to give this person some questions, and when they get the questions wrong, you have to flip this switch and shock them. And they went through hooking this other person up to this pretend shock machine, even to the extent of giving the participant a little teeny shock to say, hey, this is what it's going to feel like, because they wanted him to believe it. So they had this charade of hooking the other person up to a shock machine, and then they had the person start giving questions. And the actor in the other room, they actually used audio recordings to make sure it was consistent. But they had them say, oh, please stop, I can't take it anymore, my heart, my heart, my heart. The person was in agony. And you had this person that was told, the experiment must go on. The experiment must go on. Was told by this person in a white coat who supposedly knew what they were doing, the experiment must go on. The question was, at what point would the person say, to heck with this, I'm not doing it, I'm not hurting somebody? And at what point would they just keep flipping the switch? He found that a lot of the people went the entire way. And had it have been real, they would have given enough shocks to seriously damage or kill somebody. I think it was 2/3 did, which is, he did not find what he expected. I believe that Milgram, there's some research that says differently, but some research says that Milgram did it because he wanted to show that Americans were not like the Nazis, and we wouldn't just blindly follow orders. The Americans have this strength of independence and character, and we would make our own choices. Well, These were done on American. The subjects in the experiment were Americans. And it was guys. So they have since done an experiment with women and found similar results. That people tend to follow orders. They follow orders when the person giving the order is right there. The person receiving the punishment is not there. So you can depersonalize. When the person giving orders is in authority. When the person giving orders is taking responsibility. People are more likely to follow orders. There's a lot of different things. This is a well-known experiment because of the ethical implications. People, although nobody was physically hurt in Milgram's experiment, there was a lot of psychological damage. Imagine going through an experiment and learning that had it been real, you would have killed somebody. Learning that you were capable of that. That's what these people went through. They learned that they were capable of obeying to that extent. I can't imagine. Anyway, that was Milgram. Since then, they have done versions of the study where the pretend shock generator doesn't go up nearly as high. So the ramifications are not as extreme in terms of they wouldn't have seriously hurt somebody. That's one of the big changes that they've done. And they've done other changes too. But that's Milgram, and that's obedience to authority. We have groupthink and group polarization and social facilitation and social loafing. Groupthink and group polarization both talk about how if you're in a group and the group tends to be like-minded, you're going to get more extreme views. Group polarization is that very thing. That if you get all people who agree together, their views are going to become more extreme. Groupthink has to do with a group that is kind of isolated and not able to get opposing views and tends to have a charismatic leader. It becomes almost impossible to dissent. It becomes almost impossible to have an opposing view because the group gets so solidified. That's groupthink. Then we have social facilitation and social loafing. Okay, I'm going to talk about the social loafing piece. What they have found is that productivity, when people are working alone, sometimes their productivity is better than where they're working in groups. It just depends. Social facilitation is the other direction. Your productivity can increase if you know you're being watched. So it depends on what's going on. Social loafing is you get a group and you think other people are going to pick up the slack, so you don't work quite as hard. You're playing with your buddies and you're yapping. You're not going to work quite as hard. That's the social loafing. Social facilitation might be those small instances where you know you're being watched. You know you're being watched, you're going to be on your best behavior, and you're going to be more productive. So that is social influence. Want to talk about two more main things. One is prejudice and discrimination. We have these words, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Well, stereotypes are thoughts about a person based on their group membership. Thoughts or beliefs about a person based on their group membership. Okay? So, if you look at me and see that I'm female and assume that I am emotional, you are making a thought, or you have a thought or belief about me based on my group membership. If you look at a guy and you assume that they're going to be aggressive because they're a male, you have a thought or belief about them based on their group membership. That's a stereotype. Okay? Stereotype is the thought or belief, and stereotypes can be positive or negative. Prejudice is generally used when you're talking about a negative. Prejudice is generally used in the negative sense. And prejudice is more feelings. When you have a negative feeling towards somebody, it can be positive, but it's generally negative. When you have a negative feeling towards somebody based on their group membership. That doesn't mean that you act on it. That's the discrimination piece. Discrimination is treating somebody differently based on their group membership. Okay? Not voting for somebody just because. And that's where we get all the political argument of, well, this person didn't get elected just because they're of a certain race or gender. This person can't run for office because they are. That's where you get the discrimination. Discrimination, and the question is, where do we see discrimination today? Okay, and it's one of the biggest things out there in terms of people going back and forth about where you see discrimination today. There are specific types of discrimination. Okay? Racism, sexism, ageism, homophobia. Racism would be a different action towards somebody based on their race. That would be discrimination. Prejudice would be a different feeling towards somebody based on their race. Okay? Sexism, a different feeling. Sexism in terms of prejudice would be a different feeling based on somebody because of their sex. Sexism based on discrimination would be treating somebody differently because of their sex. Ageism, same thing. Because of somebody's age, you are either A, have a certain feeling, or B, treating them differently. Homophobia is the same thing. You are A, have a different feeling about them because they are homosexual, or acting homosexual, or B, you treat them differently because of that. That's what homophobia is, generally the literally fear of somebody who is homosexual, but it goes into the whole types of prejudice and discrimination. So, people can be treated differently because of a number of things. And those are specific types. Why? Why do we have prejudice and discrimination? Well, it goes back to, how do you form attitudes? You form attitudes through your experiences. Somebody might be prejudiced because they have had an experience with one person in that group. You might have a number of African American people that are prejudiced against policemen, because they've had a bad experience with one. And so that translates to all policemen. I'm giving you that. You might have somebody, so one experience, one or two experiences may influence and cause you to have a feeling towards people in a certain group. You also have, how do prejudice and discrimination form? Listening to people talk. You hear about people growing up with it. Growing up with people hearing people talk about certain groups a certain way. People using words that they should not use. Okay? So you can learn it by one or two experiences, so you generalize from that. You learn it by hearing stuff. You learn it by people giving you information. And that information may or may not be correct. And that information may be only one case. You have the media who is going to put a lot of different things out there. So they put one case of something happening, and then people blow it up and translate it into everybody in that group behaves that way. The issue is to get I guess, how do you solve it? And I guess solving it is trying to get people to understand that just because you belong to a certain group doesn't necessarily mean X, Y, or Z. People are individuals. I guess it's as simple and as complicated as that. Because we do, again, we're influenced by experiences, we're influenced by what other people say, we're influenced by a lot of things. Okay? The last thing is self-fulfilling prophecy and stereotype threat. These are two really interesting concepts. Self-fulfilling prophecy is basically that you live up or down to people's expectations. And that can link to things like racism, sexism, okay? Because if you grow up and people's expectations of you are at a certain level, then you tend to live to that level. This is one of the arguments against giving, having different criteria for different groups. In other words, having different criteria for giving scholarships or different criteria for entering the police force for men and women. Because, for instance, if you're holding women to a lower standard in terms of physical ability to enter the police force, then you are setting that expectation lower. So they are going to live to that expectation. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy, is that you live. So really watch, and I have seen this, really watch those expectations, because people will live up or down to what people expect of them. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Stereotype threat is kind of like that. There are a couple different areas where stereotype threat have been used. One is in the research on gender differences in math, where they actually did studies where they gave the same test to different groups, and in one case they made them think that it was a test that normally had gender differences. And in another case, they didn't say that. Well, guess what? When you put that stereotype out front and center, it affects how people perform. Another instance of doing the instance of when you do that, when that's been done, is they've given tests to people, to senior citizens. And when you put in front of them that this is a test that the older people tend not to do well on, they tend not to do as well. It's that if you are downgraded by it, if your expectations are downgraded by a stereotype, then you're going to live down to that expectation. That's what stereotype threat is. You put that stereotype front and center, and it's going to affect your performance. So that's stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. The last piece is social behavior, and we have aggression and bullying. There are different types of aggression. There's verbal aggression. Calling somebody an idiot would be a mild form of verbal aggression. You could get a lot worse than that. So verbal aggression is screaming at somebody, calling them names, being verbally aggressive, causing harm. Aggression is generally wanting to cause harm to somebody else. Verbal aggression is causing harm verbally. Relational aggression is wanting to cause harm to their relationships. That's an interesting one. The stereotype of relational aggression is middle school girls spreading rumors. That is a classic example of relational aggression, where you're trying to hurt them by hurting their relationships. And then you have actual physical aggression. Bullying is a person in authority or a stronger person being aggressive toward who they feel is weaker. Could be physically stronger, physically weaker. It could be mentally stronger, mentally weaker. It could be a different types of stronger versus weaker. The classic bullying can be physical bullying. It can be verbal bullying. We're into what now? Cyberbullying, where people pick on each other online. And it can really hurt somebody. It is a form of aggression. Okay? So, then we have bystander effect and altruism. The bystander effect says that if somebody needs help, if there's a lot of people around, they're less likely to get help. Because people see that there are bystanders and they're assuming other people are going to help. The term was coined on this case where this lady was murdered right in front of an apartment building where there was tons of people there and nobody even called the police. Because everybody assumed everybody else would. It's like it's the diffusion of responsibility. That's the bystander effect. It's you're assuming other people will take care of it, so you're less likely to take care of it. Altruism is basically doing nice things without necessarily knowing you're going to get something in return. Okay? There's total altruism, which means you know you're not going to get anything in return, but you do something nice anyway. And then there's this general, what's called reciprocal altruism, which is this idea of what goes around comes around. I'm going to pay it forward. What goes around, it's like I'm being good because I know, or that the golden rule, because I'm treating other people like I want them to treat me. That is a kind of middle ground where you're not expecting anything tangible, but there is this idea of if I'm nice to others, my life will be better in the end. And that there's nothing wrong with that. So that's altruism. Attraction, Sternberg's theory of love, and social exchange theory. Attraction, forming relationship. Okay, birds of a feather flock together, opposites attract, which is true. Do you tend to be attracted to people like you or attracted to people different than you? More often than not, we tend to be attracted to people like us. We tend to be attracted to people, and not necessarily carbon copies physically, but we tend to be attracted to people that have the same values and beliefs and the same goals, similar goals in life. That's what we mean by birds of a feather flock together. That's the whole, we tend to be attracted to people that are like us. Because that's what we feel comfortable with. Like us, and as I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be physical. This whole thing about attraction, there is a universal idea of what is attractive and not. Attraction is not beauty is not necessarily in the eye of the beholder. They've had people rate pictures, and what they found is that universally there's this kind of idea of what is considered attractive and unattractive. Part of it has to do with symmetry. If people have their face is more symmetrical, they're considered more attractive. And there's other things too. There are slight cultural differences in terms of, for instance, maybe people in some cultures tend to be attracted to people who are a little heavier versus a little thinner. But in general, when you're talking about facial features and you're talking general attractiveness, there's a consensus on what is considered attractive. Forming relationships, there are a lot of new ways to form relationships now. One of the big things is online dating. So that's a good question. How do we figure out if somebody is similar to us online? And is that a better way to figure out if somebody's similar to us, if you're talking to them online, or is it not as good? That's an interesting question. Okay. Sternberg's theory of love. Sternberg has what's called a triangular theory of love. He said that love consists of passion, commitment, and intimacy. Passion being the physical attraction. You're wanting to be with that person physically. You are romantically interested in a physical sense. That's the passion. Then you have intimacy, which is you know that person really well. And that's not the physical sense. That is, people who have been married for 50 years, for instance. They have a lot of intimacy. They've known each other a long time. They can finish each other's sentences. That's what he meant by it. So you have the passion, the physical attraction. You have the intimacy, which is knowing each other. And then you have the commitment, which is the intellectual, I have decided I'm going to be with you. I'm making that cognitive decision. So you have the passion, which is kind of like the heart. You have the commitment, which is like the head. And then you have the intimacy, which is the experience, which is knowing them, spending a lot of time and knowing them. So in an ideal relationship, you would have a balance between all three. You would have all three. And it does wax and wane over time. Relationships may start out with more passion and end up getting more intimate. Okay? So that's Sternberg. The last thing is social exchange theory. And social exchange theory has to do with pros and cons and pluses and minuses. And this idea that I'm going to choose to perform this social action based on what it's going to cost me and what it's going to get me. And people don't necessarily think that out concretely. I mean, they don't necessarily, I'm not going into it saying, oh, what's in it for me? But people take that into account. Is it worth it? So that's social psych. We have everything from attitudes, attributions, Ash and Milgram studies, prejudice and discrimination, groupthink. We have a lot of different things to talk about this week, and it all has to do with how does being around people affect our behavior.